Welcome to Cures and Capital, the podcast on value creation in biotech and pharma. I'm Martin.
I'm Simon.
And today we are talking to Stephan Christgau. Stephan is the founding partner at Eir Ventures, with broad experience from both the European and US biotech industry and academia. His research background manifested in more than 60 peer-reviewed scientific papers and more than 30 patent applications.
In this episode, you can look forward to our discussion on how a venture capitalist thinks about investments and decision-making. We will look at the value creation through the lens of a life science venture capitalist. We'll talk about portfolio management and smart risk-taking, and then we'll discuss if the VC mindset can be implemented in pharma. After the interview with Stephan, Martin and I will go over our reflections and takeaways, and as always, all views and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own and do not represent that of our employers. Now, please welcome Stephan Christgau. Welcome, Stephan.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Maybe you could start going over your bio just a little bit.
Yeah, so my name is Stephan Christgau. I am originally a scientist by training. I did my PhD decades ago at the Technical University of Denmark and UCSF in San Francisco, where I stayed in San Francisco for 3 years. And then after that, I went back here to Copenhagen, where I'm from, started in bigger companies, also in smaller companies, was also involved in starting companies. And in 2007, I entered the investment world. I joined Novo Holdings to be part of starting Novo Seeds, which is an early stage investment and company creation team there. And most recently, it's about 5-6 years ago, I left Novo and was part of starting a Nordic life science venture fund, Eir Ventures, which was launched in the summer of 2020. So we've now been investing for 4.5, almost 5 years. So that's very brief about me.
Thank you.
We can jump into it. And just to start, Stephan, I'm very happy to talk to you and that you are here because I tend to have a lot of parallels about the pharma world and the venture capital industry. And now you can either help me support the claims I have or completely debunk all of it. Now at least we'll know. But let's begin by exploring how venture capitalists evaluate investments and approach decision-making, especially given the high uncertainty associated with the early stage investments. So let's go into the specifics. Starting with the most fundamental question, and that is, how do you, as a VC investor, define what is value? What does it mean to you? What are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I would say if I should answer it very simply, obviously, as a venture investor, we have the fiduciary responsibility to take care of our investors' money and to be able to return it with hopefully a nice profit. And so in that sense, value is something quite tangible, right? It is a value being created by a project or a company developing a project. But of course, it can have additional meanings. I would say that we all on a higher level working in the healthcare industry look at value as something that actually can help people, something that actually provide a real benefit to people who have unmet medical needs or other health problems, and where new health tech or pharmaceutical innovations or biotech discoveries can provide means for treating these people. And that is obviously a big value, a societal value, but hopefully also a value that is connected with this return potential that I talked about initially, i.e. an ability to generate a higher monetary value of a project during our ownership. So it's linked to a very sort of tangible monetary assessment, but it's also, I would argue, here in the health tech space, we are working for something that has a sort of greater good. It's not because we are altruistic, but at least it's something that actually is very meaningful to serve, something that helps people.
Would you think that those two often correlate? I mean, when you look for value financial, they tend to correlate with how much value does it actually contribute to the patients?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. The correlation is not one-to-one, right? You can have some innovations which are barely providing any, have sort of a market logic, and that's why they can be translated into monetary value. But generally, there is a high correlation between something that provides help to people and something that provides value as an investment case.
Could you now take us through a little bit more practical through your analytical thinking and decision-making process when you come across a potential investment opportunity?
In most investors and actually most sort of people that look at a deal flow opportunities, there is this funnel thinking. You constantly have a lot of new projects, new companies that approach you. In our case, since we launched Eir Ventures, we've had more than 2,000 companies and investment opportunities to evaluate. We're a small team of 5-6 people. So there is this constant pressure, you can say, or constant need to sort through this. And in the end, we end up investing in 1% of the opportunities. So how do we look at this? It's sort of, we need to sort the majority out very, very quickly. And it's hard to say that is being done absolutely 100% fairly or because we cannot look at all parameters. We cannot look at every single specific element of a given case. So there will be an ability, the first, I would say, a requirement for the company to rise above the noise. And what does that mean? That means an ability to articulate their value proposition, an ability to articulate who they are, what's the plan, what do they want to do, and how much does it cost. Many companies are bad at that, especially early stage companies. And then what analytical, it's sort of in biotech, it's a complex industry because it is a matrix of many different elements that we have to consider, from science, how good is the science, how valid are the experiments, how relevant are the controls, is put into context of the unmet medical need. Are they proposing to address something that really is an unmet medical need, as I talked about before? Or is it a brilliant technology that's just addressing something that 5 other projects or technologies are also addressing? So the unmet need, the commercial opportunity is part of it. The people, who are the people who want to develop this? Is it credible that they can develop it? Do they know what they know? Do they know what they don't know, and what future competences they need to engage? And then the project plan, right? It's sort of, can we get to meaningful inflection points on a reasonable budget? We are a 125 million euro fund, so we obviously are quite conscious about the company's ability to deliver sort of value inflection point at a reasonable budget. And I think we'll come back to it in our discussions, but I just think it's so important as a biotech company to be able to be cost efficient, because as a small biotech company, you shouldn't count on, and you shouldn't have the resources at a big company, but you should use it to your advantage and be able to do more with less. So yeah, it's many things that goes into this consideration, this analysis, but it's you have to sort of score opportunities on all these parameters and then see the ones that you like. That's the one that progress further in the funnel to ultimately an investment.
Absolutely. And actually, I think it touches a little bit towards the next question: what factors determine a fundable idea from the one that lacks potential?
Yeah.
I assume we just covered most of it, or is there anything that you would add to something like that?
No, I think I mentioned it, or we covered it before, because it is, I mean, a fundable idea has to address an unmet medical need, have to have, if it's a pharmaceutical, a target product profile that is differentiated and have this commercial potential. And ideas that lacks potential could be great technologies or great discoveries, but if they can't be directed towards something that is an unmet need or something that people want to pay for, then it doesn't really move. And then, of course, there's all the other things. You could have it's an old saying that you can have great projects and great ideas, but if it's the wrong people who is developing it, then it won't go anywhere. And conversely, there's a saying, if you have even a mediocre idea, but if it's a great stellar team, it can actually move somewhere. So it goes together, I think.
Just out of my personal interest, does it happen often that you have a great fundable idea in terms of the scientific need, in terms of the commercial potential, but then the team actually isn't the right team?
It does happen, right? It does happen. And if it's a really great idea, you can try to speak with other investors or maybe current investors and see, okay, we think this could be something, but have you considered changing in management? But it can be a sort of a showstopper. And when it comes to people business, it's always something that can be sensitive and something that has to be handled in the right way.
Absolutely. And now the parallels to the life science industry, and that is very similar, like the pharma companies or the biotech companies and their assets that deal with the high probability of failure. So do VC funds, right? There is a big chance that the investment will fail, and you have to balance the risk and potential in the right way. How do you weigh the risk and reward in a deal? And how do you balance that perspective in terms of portfolio versus an individual investment in your decision?
Yeah. And you mentioned one thing here, portfolio. And as a venture investor, of course, we built a portfolio. We want to have some moonshot opportunities in that portfolio, but we do not want all our companies to be a moonshot, right? So we have to have that consideration as we build the portfolio, and to think now is the time. We may think we have 3 or 4 moonshot opportunities, then we shouldn't have any more. We should have some more safer bets in there. There's nothing safe in this business, but of course there's something where you can say, if it has got clinical data or if it has sort of got a validation of some sort that is more solid, we could go into that. But that's typically something that comes then with a lower return potential. So I think most investors would go for building a portfolio that contains some very high potential opportunities, but not too many of them. And then is how do you balance that risk? How do you which one of the high potential do you take on board? And I think you have to be really convinced about the science, the quality of the project, and that if this succeeds, it may be a high risk that it fails, but if it succeeds, then there's definitely no question that it will be a commercial success. I mean, it could be a groundbreaking new technology that would open up new therapeutic avenues, or it could be something that would address a therapy area in a completely different way, or something which would really turn, let's say, a cancer treatment on its head and be curative or something like that, or really have complete response possibilities. And then I think for investors to engage, because there are such opportunities out there, but then I come back to the people business. We would like if we realize this is a high risk project, then it's really important that we have the right people on board, right? It's always important with the right people, but in those cases, it requires that the people who are developing the projects are really up to scratch, and first of all are communicating, are telling us what happens and what goes well and not well, and also that they have that possibility, they have that they project that vision and mission to drive the project forward. I mean, I'm not saying it's not so that there are companies where management is not important, because it's important in all companies, but it especially in high potential opportunities, there's a special demand for the management.
Is it hard to find those moonshot opportunities?
Yes, I think it is hard, because there is exciting science, and so it's easy to fall in love with science, but it has to be paired with this path towards something you say, okay, it's not only fantastic science and really quality data, but it's self-evident that if they succeed with bringing this to the market, there's a huge, I mean, this will be a success. And I think the latter point is often a little bit opaque. So great science. We've discovered some new mechanism of how non-coding RNA is processed in a certain way. Fantastic. But what does it actually lead to? And that's the nature of these discoveries. And then you can, if you're a Eir Ventures or Third Rock, you can put in $100 million and you can allow them to play in the lab, and eventually something will come out. We have to take a more measured approach. And those, I think, moonshot opportunities suitable for us are harder to come by. But they exist. Definitely they do exist.
And now let's break apart a little bit the risk and reward equation. Let's start at the risk. So how do you assess risk in practice? Is it a qualitative measure? Is it a gut feeling? Or do you have any kind of quantitative assessment, such as a probability of success?
It's a good question. Yes, there are. You can take these standardized and say a preclinical project have so and so much success average to go to phase 1 and so on. But they're quite crude instruments, and in particular for early stage projects. I think to a large extent it is what you would call gut feeling, although I'm not so fond of this term, because the thinking actually goes on in the more upper part, cerebral part of the body, and not in the guts. But I think it comes a little bit from experience, and then I would say from our team, right? We are, as any other venture fund, we are a team of 6 highly trained professionals. So we look at a case and discuss, and some are more looking at some risks, and some are looking at other risks, and I may have more comfort in taking some development risk, and my colleagues may have more comfort in taking a certain commercial risk, and a third would have a different perspective. And so when we look at a case and get around it and discuss internally, I think we get risks covered. It's very important to be a team that have that are different with different perspective, and it's very hard to quantify the individual risk elements. But that said, if we look at a case and say, okay, the IP, there's something here, right? That it could be a challenge, or it could be a regulatory framework, or it could be clinical endpoints. If there are some risk elements we are aware of when we do diligence, we will of course try to engage external experts, KOLs, to try to clarify, or at least get a better view of that risk. If again it's the patents, then have the patents situation reviewed by an IP lawyer that will point to the problems in the existing IP portfolio, possibilities for maybe addressing it, and maybe, of course, in some cases, if there is a big red flag, we would say thank you, but no thanks. So it's about identifying the different elements and then trying to take an external view by experts who can then help us qualify the idea, but still at the end of the day, we will have to take a decision on whether to invest or not. And we may decide to invest with open eyes if we think there is a fantastic opportunity on other parameters, and then we live with 2 or 3 parameters where we can say that there is a higher risk here, but we'll see if we can work with it when we invest it.
Yeah. So even though it sounds like it's not too quantitative, you still have a framework or a checklist you go through, as you mentioned, right? Where you break it apart, like commercial risk, scientific risk.
Yes.
So now the other part of the equation, the reward, and this is where I'm particularly interested, because I can't count the number of times where people came to me and said, there's absolutely no point trying to ascribe value to an asset, especially early on, because no one knows what it is. So we shouldn't even start trying. And yet I find the VC industry to be exactly the side where they have to do this, even given all the uncertainty. So how do you do it?
Yes. And of course, in one hand, you could say it's super difficult. And probably if you were completely honest, all especially early stage idea would have a negative value, right? And a negative NPV. And the right answer for any investor would be to say no to everything, right? Because that would be right in most cases. If that was the view, and we'll come to it a little bit when we talk about the difference between Europe and the US, but if that was the case, right, not much innovation would ever happen. So we have to deal with it, and that's why venture capital plays an important role. We look very much at deal comparables. So if we have an early stage project that comes to us, let's say it's in the cardiometabolic space, we would see, are there some comparable projects, hopefully not identical, but at least someone has developed something that is roughly comparable. Where did they have to take it before they were able to do a transaction? What were the terms of that transaction? Could we find 3 or 4 reference cases? And then we can sort of do a metric and say, okay, if similar companies were able to do a deal where they got 100 million euro upfront at phase 1B, 2A, we can do a backwards calculation, say it cost, let's say for the sake of argument, 30 million euro to come to that data point. Well, then we can see what is left if the investors have to have at least 2.5, 3x on the upfront. And there you can see that in most cases, the valuation has to be reasonable. I would say that's this way of thinking. You don't want to come to valuations that are really prohibitively high so that they don't allow you to do a deal. So of course we also have to find a situation which is interesting for the founders and the company. So it's a negotiation. But I think the deal comparable approach is finding deal comparables is the one we put most emphasis on. Of course, we see NPV calculations of various sorts presented as well. They usually come to very high numbers. And when you have an early stage projects, it's small tweaks in your risk assumptions and commercial assumptions makes a huge difference. So yes, it has a value to look at. We are addressing this market. There's data to support that X years from now, this will be an X billion euro market in the US and Europe. And we have something we believe will be first in class or best in class for this particular disease or indication. It is useful because that again validates sort of there is a commercial potential for the target product profile, but it is rarely something that you can translate directly one-to-one down to a company valuation. And then I would just say, at the end of the day, it is a negotiation, and it is a sort of negotiation between capital and opportunity. And it's sort of, that's why you see valuations are much lower in Europe compared to the US, because there's just less capital available here in Europe. And that is also a reflection of that.
Is your approach different in terms of like the moonshots deals you mentioned? Because I guess it will be a little bit harder to find comparables.
Yeah. Yes, because somehow, but the moonshot deals are often quite early stage, right? They're sort of new. They're built on some kind of new pioneering scientific approach or technology. But still, you can use the deal comparables. You can say, okay, again, let me take a completely random example. Someone just make a new discovery in the non-coding RNA space. It's super exciting. Look to be involved in a lot of gene regulation. Then you can look at other similar companies that have brought new gene regulation technology to the market and say what value was ascribed to them, what time could they do an exit. I think another thing for the moonshot opportunities, they are often built on sort of a technology platform. And to really get value out of that, then the companies typically have their own programs to bring forward, but there will be a technology platform with a broader potential. And then it's really valuable in many ways to have an ability to do deals with bigger pharma companies. Because if you say the biotech company, we will explore this in this particular indication area or this particular technology area, but we will license out all the other uses of the technology platform to big pharma X, Y, and Z. That is validating for the commercial potential of the technology. It may bring us in some non-dilutive funding. It may ultimately be one of the big pharmas that will acquire the company, and it will give the early stage company some early exposure to pharma thinking. So I think now we've changed subject a little bit, but it's sort of ascribing value, coming back to that, an early stage company that have been able to do a pharma deal of some sort. It may be not a super lucrative, it may not be a fantastic deal that have brought in hundreds of millions, but actually that's another way of bringing value to the table, to actually having that commercial validation.
So it's not necessarily just the assets, specific assets you are looking at. There's also other stuff around it that can be valuable potentially in the future.
And especially for the moonshot opportunities we talked about, the technology as such, or the sort of proprietary know-how of the company is of course super important.
And now the next question, I think, again, you touched upon it a little bit, but now I'm just interested. So your view on the traditional DCF-based models and the resulting NPVs and EMPVs, it sounds like you are not really using them as part of your evaluation.
Yeah, no, we don't. We have a few cases, spent some time on it, and those are the cases where we have a couple of companies that do lab tools or sort of technology for the life science industry, and they are closer to an actual commercial stage. And then, of course, when you have line of sight to some commercial activity, then it does make sense to do this. But for an early stage preclinical cancer company, it's sort of, it's not very useful. I think the uncertainties in each element and each step are so big that you can't really get an accurate number, but it could still be useful to do the exercise because it requires you to sort of address the market. What is our total addressable market? Why do we believe we can get this share of the market? What is our assumption that we will use? And then we can have a discussion around those rather than the actual number coming out from the model.
And can I ask, because now you also make the distinction, right? There's a difference between very, very early stages, so preclinical, and then the closer, of course, you are getting to market, you have very different information or you have much more details. But then do you then potentially start to use the traditional DCF models when you're looking in terms of potential exit opportunities? I mean, when you are then negotiating?
Good question, right? Because ultimately, when the companies come to the stage where it becomes relevant for them to engage with the bigger pharma companies, we know the bigger pharma companies will use this metric, right? And therefore, of course, at that stage, now I may sound like a double moral, but we know we have to prepare those numbers because that will be expected of us in a negotiation with a pharma partner. And in that case, we do use it. As you can hear from me, I don't know if the numbers are certainly not to be taken as accurate assessments, but doing the exercise, again, it is actually the preparation to do the exercise where you sort of think through, why do I believe I can get this market share here, this market share there? Why do I believe the number of addressable patients are this large? Doing all that is useful in any case and make you much better able to, in a discussion with a potential pharma acquirer or licensor, to argue for why you think the price should be as it should be. So yes, you have to do that as part of your homework in a transactional situation.
But I think that has also been a great takeaway because I think people very often get hang up on like, I'll do a DCF and all that matters is my final number. And then if it's negative, I say no. And if it's positive, I say yes. But it's almost like the process of getting to it is more important because that's where you uncover all the uncertainties. That's where you uncover what would have to be true for me to believe in this. Right?
Yes. And yeah, exactly. You can discover some really important uncertainties and say, I mean, we assume we have so many patients, but actually there are these publications or so, and it could be, this is really the crux of the matter, or it could be the risk of the clinical trial, or, I mean, you do that exercise to actually clarify all this. And of course, if you are in a buying situation, as I am as an investor, I would sort of look at the risk and sort of challenge all those. And if you're in a selling situation, and you will have to argue for why you believe the risk are not as large as the other parties say, and why you think the potential is much larger than they say.
Absolutely.
Stephan, so what aspects of the VC portfolio thinking could be brought into pharma companies?
Yeah, I think if we take a portfolio view, and we just talked about it here, right? We have to build a portfolio with some high risk, high reward opportunities that really can give 10 times the money back, but we have to balance that with some lower risk opportunities. I think in a big pharma, I often lack this sense that they recognize or they have the mandate to take in something with higher risk and something with lower risk. That's why it's very difficult for some pharma companies to do early stage deals, because they're faced with all this uncertainty and they just see risk, and it's difficult for them to argue internally in the different decision bodies for doing a deal. But if they now looked at it from a more sort of venture portfolio perspective and say, this is actually our moonshot. We can go in here. Yes, there is high risk on these and these parameters, but it also has huge potential. And so get that organizational buy-in for that maybe is only possible if you can balance it across a portfolio. But I think in big pharma companies, it's very much on a deal-to-deal basis. Of course, there's a franchise thinking, but it's not really a portfolio thinking as such.
Yeah.
So every deal gets sort of measured on the same parameters, and then it's sort of more of the same, right? It's sort of, we know that our regulatory teams are super risk averse on this and this parameter, so we don't want to bring anything up to the committee unless they have full tox package. And of course, that it's very easy in a big pharma company to just say, okay, we need to have all that in place, and then only do the safer bets. And especially in big pharma companies, then accept you have to pay more. But if you had a portfolio thinking, you could take some earlier stage, more risky bets, but of course balance it also with some safer bets.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I have a more maybe of a personal question. So let's say we put you inside a pharma company and ask you to run the entire investment committee 100% as a venture capitalist. And then how could that work, do you think? So if the team, an asset team comes up and say, now here's a bag of money onto the next value inflection point, and if you don't make it, that's just tough luck.
Yeah, it's a good question, because of course I am painfully aware that in a big pharma company you will have to think in the commercial franchise strategy. There are elements that I don't have to worry about. That I talked about building a portfolio of high and lower risk opportunities, but here they have to ultimately fit into the overall strategy of the company. But what could I imagine in this artificial situation? I would advocate for a bit more risk taking. I think many big organizations are inherently risk averse. So I think that is one thing, and that has to be paired with what we in the investment world are also tasked with, is to be better able to stop projects when they don't have any more potential, right? Because when you take higher risk opportunities, you also have to be able to say, okay, we made a bet here. We now can see the data. We shouldn't put more effort into this. But I think once a project has its own life in a big pharma company, it's much more difficult to kill it. Yeah. And there is always going to be arguments for continuing, always arguments for doing yet another experiment. Yes, we did see this, but the world is never black and white, or very rarely at least. It's always shades of gray. So I think I could bring, and now I'm sitting here like I'm applying for a job in a big pharma company, which rest assured I'm not, but I think I could bring this sort of risk willingness, try to take some decisions, also a little bit bolder decisions, and then focus on the projects really and be able to take the tough decisions. And it's pretty banal, and I'm pretty sure that pharma companies are doing this already, but with a venture thinking, it sharpens the mind. And especially from a venture fund like ours, where we are very mindful that we are a 125 million euro fund, and we have to make this last and bring real opportunities that ultimately will benefit patients.
Okay. But at least it's an encouragement for pharma companies to maybe run a fraction of the portfolios in this way. We can see if we have headhunters reaching out to you, Stephan. But I have a follow-up question. Yeah. We talked a little bit before, and then you mentioned, which can roughly be summed up as the disease of big, rich pharma companies, which is the phenomenon of too much money and too little pressure. Can you try to compare and contrast with the VC or the startup environment, and how does it impact value creation, you think?
I think, so we talked about before how to put a value on a deal. And I said that we look very much on deal comparables. We have to look at the upfronts and near-term milestones, and that has to be able to drive the return for us investors. And therefore, the valuation of the companies have to be compatible with those deals. And, in Europe in particular, there are deals done in the 100 to 300 million euro upfront plus near-term milestone deal. There is less than a handful 1 billion euro deals a year. It's really not many. And so if you do the math, it matters that you haven't invested a ton of money in the projects, or put another way, you have to be cost efficient. Of course, drug development costs what it is. It's expensive. And if you have to do a tox experiment, you have to do a tox experiment. I'm not arguing for evading things that you have to do. But in a big pharma thinking, because of the risk aversion, there is a tendency to rather do one experiment more than one experiment less, especially in the early stages, right? Why don't we do yet another cardiovascular safety study? Why don't we do 3 phase 1 or 4 phase 1 studies instead of 1 phase 1 study? Whereas a biotech company really have to think about hard, what is the data we really need? What is the essential question we need to address in this experiment? How can we design this clinical protocol so we get the right information out? So the cost efficiency drives a laser sharp focus on value creation. And I think actually European companies have been much better at cost efficiency than US ones. And I think it has to a large extent been driven by the fact that our venture funds here in Europe are much smaller in the US. We now see that venture funds are getting bigger, and we do see financings like in the US where Series A rounds of 100, 200, 300 million euros. And of course, for those few companies that are able to do those financing, it's great. But I would also, and I wouldn't argue against good financing, that's not the point, but it doesn't really breed a cost efficiency mindset. And a company that maybe have raised 300-400 million euros, maybe on valuations of 300-400 million, they're suddenly a €500 million company. And for those companies to be entertaining a deal, then you'd have to see more than €1 billion upfront and near-term milestone. And I just don't see many of those, and in particular where the stock markets have been closed now for 2 or 3 years. And I don't think there's any immediate sign that they will open up here in Europe. There is still an IPO market in the US, but not a very good one. And I think the outlook, at least for the next couple of months, look problematic. Yeah. So I think it does just argue for keeping cost efficiency, keeping your focus on doing as much as you can with as little money as you need.
Oh, that makes sense. And we talk a little bit about, you mentioned this, take some risky bets, but also be ready to terminate the project. So do you upfront sit down and write on a piece of paper your quitting criteria going into a deal, and then you know exactly if you hit them or you don't, and then you stop, or how does it work? Or I mean, you have meetings with your business partners.
Yeah.
Or how do you actually approach stopping?
Simon, it's a good question. Yes, maybe we should do that. I mean, we do an investment memo, right, like everyone else do when they do the investment. And in some investment, there is a quite binary sort of event. It could be we invest in this company, the main project goes into a clinical trial. We need to see a positive outcome on the target or pathophysiology we're addressing. But in many cases, it's difficult, and it's more difficult than so, and you can actually also have companies that are working towards the goal, but getting delayed, right? That happens more often than not, and not being able to reach the milestones with the financing. It could be team issues emerging along the way. It could be competitors emerging along the way. So it's difficult to completely set out from the beginning the parameters that would be a no-go. You have to keep an eye out for it, because there is situations where the competitive field is just changing. I mean, as one thing you can say, 10 years ago, immuno-oncology was incredibly hot. A lot of things happened, to the extent now that we have hundreds, if not thousands, of projects in development in immuno-oncology. And even though it has done miracles for the cancer patients, and there are some incredible therapies that have been introduced in the clinic, now at this time, it is just very, very hard to predict which of the revolutionary technologies that are still in development will actually make it and make a difference. And in particular, some of the more exotic approaches like CAR T therapies and other, they have not lived up to their potential, not because they didn't work, because I think they've actually worked in the patients where they've been tested, but simply because there's so much else happening. So the whole competition in a field can change and make projects that you set out to do when they were promising, suddenly they have less of a promise. So you just need to monitor it. You need to discuss it. And this is something in all venture funds in the investment team. We constantly discuss the portfolio and go through it and see who do we believe are the winners and who are not, and try to reach agreement, which of course is always a challenge. We all have our favorites, and that's why you need, again, I'll stress the importance of being a team with people with different perspectives.
So do you think VCs are better than pharma companies in terminating projects, maybe because of the distance? Maybe you don't see the people every day, but you still, of course, have meetings with them also in VC. But do you think VCs have a better track record in stopping?
This would be really based on, I have limited or actually no statistic in front of me. But I think, yes, it's companies, right? We are distant from the entities over which we decide. That's not to say it's super hard, right? And these are people we work with, and it's super, super hard. So it's not taken lightly. And another point, sort of in big pharma, there are constantly management rearrangements, strategy reconsidering, where many projects are falling victims to that. But that may be entirely for reasons unrelated to the project and the data of the project. It's sort of, so it's not that big pharma cannot close projects. It happens all the time, but I think sort of the run-of-the-mill project that has buy-in from the committee of vice presidents that needs to see it developed and can produce a semi-annual or annual progress report. I think those projects, I know of many that sort of are just running along and have been doing that for many years. And we don't need to mention any names, but we can all probably think of companies where if you really think critically about the innovation coming out of the research R&D departments over the last decades, considering what has been invested there, and then you can maybe come to the conclusion that it has not been overly impressive. And yeah, so I think, yes, venture capitalists are probably better at terminating projects, but it is my totally subjective sentiment, and it's with all kind of reservations.
That's fair.
Yes, and I actually have a small sub question to this, because what I noticed in the beginning, Stephan, you were quite tangible in how you defined value in the venture capitalist industry, right? And I'm wondering, could it be that because what value is to you is kind of very clear, while it is very different for different teams in a pharma company? I mean, for an R&D team, value is something different than for a finance team, than for a commercial team. And because they start to actually have a conflicting definition of what value means, they can stack onto projects much longer. I mean, if you hold on to a project that isn't too valuable, you are now losing potential of what the tangible definitions you had could have been instead, right? So the opportunity cost of holding on to a bad project for you is actually quite high.
Yeah, yes, I think it's certainly a valid proposition. And you to be going along those lines, I mean, you definitely could have different sort of value definition in different organizations and different parts of the organization. So that, I mean, the R&D people, they just want to keep their models running and keep their projects running, and the commercial department wants something they can say to new products they can introduce. And yeah, there may be it is obviously more of a challenge in bigger organizations to ensure that everyone marches in the same direction. That's a classical observation that all the way since Roman times have been described by different people who are thinking about it. And there are different approaches to that. And of course, I think big pharma companies are also aware of it and try to address it. But in a big pharma company, the value, yes, ultimately will have to be products that helps patients, but it also have to align with the company strategy. And it's my experience that at regular intervals with new management, there is a strategy change. So in these organizations, you can have this sort of sudden change in what is defined as value that can be quite difficult to handle, because drug development is necessarily something that you have to have a long perspective. And then if you along the way suddenly changes that, it sort of can really mean that whole divisions or whole portfolio of projects are suddenly ascribed little value, or suddenly ascribed a lot of value that is due to entirely these internal organizational considerations. So I think, yeah, that's another point in addressing the question there.
And thank you. You actually took my very unstructured question and structured it quite nicely into a cohesive answer. So I appreciate it. Thank you. And I think now we are moving on to more of an industry perspective. And we want to start by saying that over the last couple of episodes from different guests, we have kept hearing, or we have heard about the decline in the R&D productivity and the pressure on the return on innovation in the pharma industry, right? And we can see all the statistics where the return on innovation on the IRR is getting below the cost of capital. So it's actually at a point where you're almost destroying value by investing into certain assets. How is it from your perspective as a VC? What is the ROI in the life science VC space?
Yeah, it's a good question. And sort of our industry also have business cycles. And if we go 4 or 5 years back, there was a tremendous boom years. There were deals, there were a lot of IPOs, very, very nice ROIs. Eir Ventures were launched just at that time, right? And then since then, we've had 3, 4 years with depressed markets, can't really do IPOs. All the public companies are falling. And is it overall more I think there is this sort of the low-hanging fruit have to some extent been harvested. It may be not to the full extent, right? But the sort of very straightforward discoveries, the sort of biological pathway that easily lends itself for pharmacological intervention have been exploited in most cases. So some of the innovation happening now are sort of more challenging, entails a higher risk, higher complexity, it requires a little bit more, or maybe a lot more investment, addressing clinical diseases where you do large clinical trials, more expensive investments in the later stage clinical development. So there is maybe some truth in that it's harder to obtain a higher ROI. But then again, I would also say there are many factors that are still favorable in this industry. I mean, we are getting older. We have more and more people with diseases in the Western world, just due to the demographics. We are spending a fairly large percentage of our GDP on healthcare, and that's unlikely to change. And there is certainly still a lot of unmet medical need. That I think is the fundamental consideration. There is a lot of people now not receiving adequate therapy for their diseases. And as long as that is the case, there will be a need for innovation. And then we can take situations such like, let me just take an example as antimicrobial resistance. We know that it's a problem, that there's been very little innovation in this field. We know that gram-negative, in particular pathogens, are emerging that are now multi-resistant, even some pan-resistant pathogens that are not responding to any of our known antibacterials. And yet it is an area where basically all investments have been completely unprofitable. There's actually companies that have invested in and brought to the market new antibacterials that have gone bankrupt because it's being used so little and being reserved to the third line therapies. So this I would describe as a market anomaly. And I'm also pretty sure at some point it will be addressed. When is that point? I thought it would happen 10 years ago, but it still really haven't happened. And big pharma companies and foundations have stepped in and funded some of this research with philanthropic funding. But so I bring this up as an example to say that just because there is an obvious unmet medical need doesn't mean that there is a commercial opportunity right away. But I think if you keep the long perspective, yes, there will be. And again, here when God forbid, but if millions of people start dying from multi-resistant bacterial infections, things will happen, right? Things will happen. But if we are hopeful, we could think that before that happens, then there will be some commercial incentives for bringing such products to the market.
But I have two follow-up questions to this, because I think on one end you described that the low-hanging fruits they haven't picked, but also actually there are new opportunities, right? Or there are still opportunities, but also new opportunities keep arising. So do you have a feeling that over time it has been harder to find good value, or not necessarily because of this offsetting factors?
It's sort of the biotech industry in the US is maybe 40 years old, and in Europe 25, or maybe a little bit older. But it's not a terribly old industry. And maybe the whole pharma industry, if you discount sort of aspirin and the various sort of unscientifically discovered things that was it's really an industry that's 100 years old or less. And most, if not all, of the first discoveries were quite sort of serendipitously discovered and have been attractive. And I think, is the inventions now compensated or being given less commercial potential? No, I don't think so. I think if there are still every year deals being done, new product being brought to the market, new markets being opened up. I mean, we are sitting here in Copenhagen, Denmark, and 10 years ago, there was not really many who believed the obesity market was such a big market. And I remember projects that were looked at and say, it's a lifestyle condition. Nobody will really take that kind of drugs in large and now it is a more than 100 billion market and growing tremendously, and to the extent that it really affects the GNP of our country here, one product from one company. So I think you can still find healthcare innovation that is really commercially attractive. Can you find a new Wegovy every year? Probably not, and probably we shouldn't, because we would bankrupt the world economy. But there are still discoveries being made, and I think we didn't talk about it, but it's quite beautiful the way that you have a patent protection to protect your IP and the huge investment and the risk you're taking, because that gives you an ability to get a reward for that innovation and that investment. And then it goes off patent, and then there should be really price pressure on these discoveries as they get sort of common knowledge and can be produced as everyone. So it's not so that there is an accumulation of super expensive products, and therefore the healthcare systems can still cope with new innovation being brought forward, because there's also constantly a loss of patent exclusivity on older products that then gets cheaper available. So we have to bear this in mind, and that's why I think the system is sustainable and will continue to reward new innovation.
But that leads me to my second sub question. That is it possible to make consistent returns in the VC sector? And are there examples of such companies that consistently delivered returns investing into biotechs?
It's a difficult question, yes, and because I think most of the funds that have existed for a long time, that are now in their fund 9 or 10 or 11, will have some of their funds that haven't delivered as good a return. I just think that's the case. I can't think of a single one that have uniformly high return in all funds, because even though you have a portfolio consideration, even though you try to do your best to balance risk and reward, it is just a risky business. And if your 3 high potential, high reward opportunities all fail, it can be difficult for the rest of the portfolio to deliver. So yeah, it's I don't know if there are such examples, Martin, but it could be, and I would be certainly happy to be corrected. But I think it's also important for investors in this business, and now I'm thinking for our investors, the LPs, to have a longer perspective and say, we are in this business. If I was an LP investor, a pension fund, I would invest in 10 venture funds, right? And then you have 10 venture portfolios. And even though some of the portfolios would deliver less than other portfolios, if you look at it on that perspective, for sure there will be a positive outcome, and I think that's the approach you should take in this industry.
Absolutely, that's a great answer.
So, Stephan, you talked already about that you want to kind of fund the opportunities in a way that stimulates this cost-effective operations in the companies. So if we look inside the companies, what are the hallmarks of a powerful innovation culture in your mind? I almost heard that if you don't cash strap the companies, but you give them, of course, sufficient funding to reach their milestones. But what is the culture and what does good look like?
Yeah. So I think it's very much comes down to the people in the team. They have to have this entrepreneurial spirit. It's difficult to articulate exactly what it is, but I mean, really get stuff done. The get stuff done gene has to be fully expressed. When you're in a small biotech company, you really have to do it. You have to know that stuff are only happening if you're doing it. And then, of course, they have to be working together as a team in that mindset, and also be supplementing each other. Just as I talked about our investment team in the companies, you're relatively few people in a small biotech company, but it's super important that every person is respected and able to contribute, and that they bring different competencies and different viewpoints and perspectives to the table. So diversity in the team and competence of what each individual bring in there. And then I think the last thing I'll mention is transparency of communication. Be able to communicate exactly what you're doing to the whole company, so everyone knows that they're going to the same direction. Communicate when things happen, and they will happen in biotech, both to the company, but certainly also to investors and board members, and be open to find suggestion, not try to keep the things hidden and sweep it under the rug and try to say, oh, well, we got some bad data here, but I'm sure it will be better next time. Because if those bad data are really crucial, then it should be discussed and everyone should know, and we should discuss whether there are things we need to do differently. And of course, it is very difficult, right? Because it can be the lifeblood of a team or as a founder, then they sit with this. But they have to realize that no one knows everything, and that's why you have a small team. That's because you need to use your team members' expertise and competencies, and you should also, with the same token, approach your board and investors to discuss difficult things or good things and opportunities and challenges in a structured way where you can take input. But as a captain of a little biotech ship, you also should have your course in mind and be able to steer towards that. So it's a lot of things I mentioned here rest on the shoulders of the management team, but they have a huge task, but they also have a fantastic mission to create new opportunities.
So let me jump to the question. I will ask you to give the biopharma executives out there a piece of advice. If you could only give one, what would it be?
Only one advice.
You can give three if you feel you have.
No. But I would be very clear on your mission. I would say now we're talking to the biopharma executives, and maybe in particular of the small companies, because I mentioned before, you're sitting as a sort of get stuff done. You're sort of in the eye of the hurricane with big and small things, and it can be very easy to drown in details and drown in all the operational things you have to do. And you need to take care of them, right? And if the samples are stuck in the customs at Frankfurt Airport, something has to be done, and it may be you who have to do it. But you still need all the time to have that clarity of the mission you're going, be able to steer towards that. And I see many times people have difficulties between this zooming in on the operational details and zooming out of the overall strategy. And you have to be able to do both, right? You have to be able to deal with stuff, but as a management, it's also your responsibility to keep the ship at the course towards the long-term vision.
That's very clear.
That's a very clear advice. So now we are coming to an end. And is there anything we didn't talk about that you feel is important to add before we end our conversation?
No, I think we've been through things, and I hope I haven't been too sort of putting too much demand on biotech entrepreneurs. As I said, there is a lot on the table as a biotech entrepreneur, a lot of things you have to do. But I think it is also a very rewarding chance to be able to work on your project, an idea, or work in a startup, feel that energy, feel that direct contact with the things you're doing or not doing, have a direct consequence with the development. So I think I would advocate people who have that, they think they have an entrepreneur in their belly, if we talk about gut feeling, then to give it a try and work in a biotech startup. And I hope we are getting here in Europe to the same culture in the US as where even if it doesn't succeed, it's not a catastrophe. You can only bring a lot to experience that you can move on with. And I hope we'll see more entrepreneurs. And then I hope we will also see more general investors entering into this space. There is a huge imbalance between all the opportunities we see, the innovation here, in particular in the Nordics, and then the limited amount of professional capital. And that is, of course, because institutional investors here in Europe in general and in the Nordic in particular do not invest in this sector. If they invest in the sector, they invest in the US, which is not really benefiting the local ecosystem.
Is there maybe, and now I have a sub question, is there maybe something behind this? I mean, is there something causing the fact that people are simply not investing in Europe in this sector, or is it many different factors?
There are probably different factors, but there is perception. If you sort of prompt them, they say the European sector is less developed, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because if they never invest, they will never be developed. But I think it's also a wrong statement because Europe can be just as profitable. There is some statistics from the EIF saying that in some years there's actually been higher return of investment for European life science venture funds than US venture funds. So I think there are some misperceptions among general investors, and also a lack of knowledge. And of course, a pension fund should not know everything about cancer biology. But here in Denmark, where life science is the biggest industry in the country, it is kind of remarkable that all our big pension funds have no one employed that knows anything about life science, right? I mean, they have people who know about real estate, or they have people who know about energy markets and so on. And of course, I can't speak. I don't know if there should be a single PhD in some pension fund somewhere that does something else. But in general, they are really far from our line of business, and that is a little bit strange to me.
And what have you been reading lately? Both me and Simon, we are very avid readers. Is there anything you would recommend to us and the listeners?
Well, most recently, I've actually been reading a book about Philippine history because I was in the Philippines a few weeks ago. So that is, maybe not a novel, quite interesting.
No worries.
Yeah.
I think the Philippine history is quite exotic in many ways.
It's definitely not something I expected.
No.
So, and then we'll of course link to Eir Ventures. But if our listeners wanted to follow up with you or see anything from you, where could they follow up? Would it be on LinkedIn?
LinkedIn, yes. We have our little
LinkedIn.
LinkedIn page. People are most welcome to follow that. And that's where we post news. I would say our web page is not that active. It exists and we post things, but we should probably do more. And yeah, that's the social media channels we have right now. We are debating whether to do more, but I think to do something, you have to be able to be convinced about you can do it right and update stuff. And we're not quite convinced we have the time for that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Stephan.
Yeah,
it has been a great conversation.
Yeah,
thank you very
much. And
take care.
Yeah, bye-bye.
So Martin, this was our conversation with Stephan Christgau. It's the first time we have a VC on the podcast. What did you take away?
I'm just smiling because, as I said in the beginning, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while. So there is so much I could start saying and go in a very unstructured direction. But I will start hopefully a bit structured, and that is the venture capitalist mindset. And I think there was so many things that Stephan said that like struck home. There's so much that venture capitalists have to think about in terms of portfolio and risk optimization and risk and reward trade-off, where I think pharma companies could really learn from. I mean, how do you don't just look deal by deal and asset by asset perspective, but how do you, instead of just doing that and then never be willing to accept the risk, how do you spread that conversation about maybe I'm willing to accept this risk because it's offset in the rest of the portfolio? And then maybe you would incentivize the companies to actually take on more risk, which could perhaps result in more innovation being done, of course, unless it's completely mindless risk. But you are Mr. Portfolio Management. Is there something you see I misconstrued here?
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, remember that venture capital is about taking extreme risk, right? So we need to have that in mind if we want to think about having a VC mindset in pharma. I think it's fine that you need a distribution of risk in your portfolio, some moonshots and some more bread and butter projects, that's fine. But just say that we can transfer the same mindset easily to pharma, I don't know. I like Stephan's idea also that you need to sort of encourage the opportunities to operate in a cost-effective manner. I think that's very healthy for innovation and for biotech companies. Can that be transferred to a pharma setting? Maybe to some degree. I don't know if it would actually stimulate more risk-taking, more bold shots, or actually the opposite. Because if you know you have almost like a fixed sum of money to reach the next value inflection point, would it then be more or less risk-averse? But it's intriguing.
I agree that there's also a danger that if we say cost efficiency, I think if you tell finance person cost efficiency, they will see something very different than what I believe Stephan was describing, right? It was about this mindset of, yes, you can spend the money and maybe very often you even should, right? But at least you should always question whether you really need that thing or not. It's not necessarily about let's spend half of what we always do and it will fall into place. But I think I don't see the mindset very often. I think he was right in a way that big pharma companies really have the luxury of being able to do everything. And they often do. And maybe they shouldn't always do it.
No, I think also we have in several of the previous episodes, we have talked about the challenges around terminating projects and these zombie projects that live in the industry. I don't think there's as much of that in venture capital because at some point you're going to run out of funding. So it's like it has a natural mechanics to it. So I think that might make it more efficient. But remember, again, venture capital is about very, very high risk, but still we could have venture capital-like opportunities in a portfolio, and that'd be great. I was wondering if you could set up and say, let's take a fraction of the R&D investments you make in the companies, and then we're gonna make a venture capital-like set up. Maybe not like, I don't know, perhaps a corporate venture capital, but at least something where you separate it out as almost like its own entity, perhaps not legally, but then at least internally with its own governance and its own rules to stimulate some very wild moonshots. And then you can run a traditional pharma portfolio with the rest of the capital. And maybe some companies are doing it out there, then they can tell us.
But I mean, we have certain examples of companies that start to go in that direction, right? Bridge Bio, I mean, is it a VC fund? No, it's a pharma company essentially, right? That runs it on a very similar structure. They have created a portfolio where the portfolio companies are almost like the individual companies, but they still put it into a portfolio structure that is very venture-like.
Yeah, and I think Vibe Bio is setting up something similar, I believe so. But again, then we're talking about a structure that lives outside the traditional pharma ecosystem. So it's more, could you bring it in or do you need to bring it out? But that's the good old ambidextrous organization, this explore, exploit. How do you manage these wild moonshot, the new ideas simultaneously with looking at maximizing your brands and everything else you have ongoing? But remember, Martin, that we also talk here at a very early stage. So it's seed capital, maybe Series A. And then you want to take more risk, maybe in a pharma company, do the moonshots. But at some point, maybe one of those moonshots will grow up and you need to put it in phase 3 and you're betting a big chunk of the entire company. But at that time point, the VCs might be out of it, right? They made the exit already. And then it's for someone else too. So the risk is not on their shoulders at that point, that's how the model works. But let me ask about the valuation process and the investment process in venture capital, because it's super competitive. And we talked about how many thousands of pitches they get in a fund like Eir Ventures. So what do you think about the process?
I think when I was asking the question, I was kind of expecting Stephan will say, yes, we do DCF. That's all we do. I think he kind of proved me wrong in that they use comparables. I have to say, I mean, I have done exactly 0 venture capitalist deals and valuations, so I can't really speak to the VC way of doing it. But I think what he said in terms of valuation in general, I think it struck home because I have done a couple of valuations in the pharma industry. And I think what really opened my eyes, and we have heard this, I believe, with a couple of guests before, it's a topic that keeps popping up, is that I think traditionally you use your valuation as a tool to get to the final number that will either justify what you have done or you want to use it to justify what you are about to do. While it is so much more, it's about what you learn in the process of getting to that number. It should spark up conversations instead of everyone getting hung up on, that's a negative number, I don't agree with this and I don't agree with that. Is okay, what should we do to make it positive? Where are we willing to take on more risk? Are we willing to spend more money to ensure it's a success? If we are not happy with the commercial potential in the case, are we willing to spend more to ensure we really extract as much value out of it commercially as possible? Instead of, I don't agree on your financial assumption here, I don't agree about the currency used there, because then you completely miss out the value of what you could have gotten out of that exercise.
And what do you think now? We are several episodes in, and also some that will be released after this one, and have not heard a single person say that they put a lot of weight into the actual output of the valuation models. It's basically, it comes down as a conversation tool and that's it. So what does that trigger any reflections?
I actually, speaking for myself, I think I more and more believe that it should be a discussion tool. It should be part of the decision making, but not in the way that finance people would hope it to be. It shouldn't be the negative number means you shouldn't do a certain project or not. But I think it should definitely be part of the decision making of that. If I'm looking at an asset, before I go and commit the resources, if there are certain things I could do to make sure I tilt the risk reward equation to a more positive balance, or if I could explore a way in which I will design it a little bit different, and maybe I will be able to make the trials faster by just spending a little bit more money, that's where this kind of tool should come in. It should help us make the right trade-offs. It shouldn't necessarily be there to say yes or no. So that's the kind of reflection I'm really starting to slowly move towards, that it can be so much more than just the final number.
You will be a gut feeling decision maker in 5 episodes, Martin.
Yeah, I don't think I will get there, but yes, it's moving in an unpredictable direction.
Yeah, but it's the same for myself. I think it's a more balanced approach, perhaps. That's not all about the data, but it also takes experience and expertise to really see behind the numbers, because the model is just numbers and they all look the same. So you need to understand deeply the R&D value chain, whether you work in finance or anywhere else in the company, before you can step back and have that overview of, or put the valuation model in perspective.
And I think that's very important to actually emphasize. I think it takes so much more than just a knowledge of a finance person to make a better model. I think it actually takes the knowledge of the organization to be really able to interpret the model in a way that provides valuable information, right? I think that's where the value is being created, is using this as a topic of discussion or part of discussion, which really takes, you also need to take in the perspectives. It's not just more finance knowledge to a finance person and learn 2 or 3 other formulas. It's really the knowledge of the organization has to come into that model, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense.
I don't have anything else to add.
Me neither. I think there's a lot to digest, but it will take time.
Yeah, and thanks again for listening in, and thanks for all the very nice feedback that we've received in direct messages and people we meet in real life. So please keep it coming, and do let us know if you have any feedback on how we could improve the podcast series here. We're also very interested if you know people we should bring in as guests in the series. And you can find us on our LinkedIn page. Just search for Cures and Capital podcast, and then you will not miss any of our insights, and you can join the conversation with other professionals in the industry. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.